Okay, it is 6 o'clock. Welcome everybody to the Heroes to Hives and Michigan Food and Farming Systems monthly webinar. This webinar I'm going to be doing myself tonight, and so I'm going to be running the show here, both giving the presentation and monitoring the chat. So just keep that in mind as we're going through the webinar tonight. This is being recorded and will be posted to the Heroes to Hives website, or excuse me, YouTube channel this week for everyone who is not able to make it. So this is our monthly webinar, and this month we've got a very special topic to my heart, which is integrated pest management. And tonight what we're going to be talking about, let's get this all set up here. Tonight what we're going to be talking about is combining farm-specific knowledge with scouting to form integrated pest management plans. And this is a topic that I think is something that a lot of us kind of, as small farmers, myself included, we run a 40-acre diversified farm here in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. For small scale farmers, this is something that we hear a lot about, is integrated pest management and management plans and scouting and all of these things. But it's not something that a lot of small farmers have experience with or even engage with or try to implement into their own operations. And so myself and a friend of mine, Jason Matlock, you see on here, developed this lecture many years ago, actually when we were in grad school about 10 years ago. And I've kind of adapted to it after, over the years. But the whole goal of this lecture is really to give small scale farmers an idea of what scouting is like and to set you up to a point where you can actually start developing your own integrated pest management plans with action and economic thresholds, meaning with numbers that this is when I need to take action, or this is when I'm going to start losing money based on the number of insects that you're counting in an area and in a crop. So that's what this lecture is all about. Now, this is part one of a two-part lecture. So part one tonight, we're going to be talking about the fundamentals of scouting. We're going to be talking about kind of what scouting is and what you do and why it's important. And then we'll also get into the data that you should be collecting as part of your regular scouting and cropping systems. And this can be applied to any crop that you produce, no matter what variety it is or any of that. So all of what we're going to be talking about tonight is all something that you can personally put into action in your own operation. Part two of this lecture is the webinar for next month in April, and that's going to be on April 15th, and I'll have the information for that here at the end of this lecture. Next month, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be actually putting everything that we talk about tonight into action, and I'm going to give you templates for data collection next month and a template for actually developing your own graphs so that you can actually develop economic and action thresholds for crops specifically. So this is kind of to set us up for being able to do that. This is something that, like I said, a lot of people don't do, and it is something that is work intensive. But it's something I think that's really valuable no matter what you're producing, on what scale you're at. It's valuable because this exercise in developing these types of things, starting to implement scouting, it's going to give you a depth of knowledge with your crop, with your insects, with what's on your land in a very meaningful way. So it's not something that's just to kind of get to this point where you can make a decision accurately on pest management, but it's also to give you a depth of knowledge about your crop and what you're dealing with, both bad insects and good insects in these agricultural systems. So that's what we're after tonight. As you have questions tonight, since I'm monitoring all of this myself, I'd ask if you have any questions as we're going through, put those in the chat, and then we'll come to those at the end of the lecture, and I'll answer all of those questions tonight for you. So we'll get started here. Please make sure to keep yourself on mute during the lecture because this is being recorded. And if we do get some latecomers to the audience, I will maybe pause for just a second and admit those individuals as they're coming in if we have any late arrivals. So let's get started. All right, so combining farm-specific knowledge with scouting to form integrated pest management plans. All right, so no matter what crop you're growing in all agricultural systems, pests are going to be one of the biggest challenges that you're going to have. Especially for small producers and new producers, in particular, beginning farmers. A lot of times we've read a lot about the crops that we're going to grow. We may have know the crop intimately, but a lot of times we have no idea the pests that we're going to be dealing with. And, depending on the crop that you're in, there are some regular pests that you might expect to see, like corn earworm, or, for more generalist pests that you might see in all cropping systems, like you have Japanese beetle here that you see in a ton of different systems. And then you see things like spider mites and those types of things in a lot of different systems. These are things that can be in many different crops, but oftentimes they may prefer one crop over another. And so if you're someone that's growing multiple crops, which is typical of most small scale or medium scale diversified farmers, we're not just growing, one crop. We're growing multiple different crops, and you actually will see in different crops, different pests will gravitate to different crops. Some pests will be more attracted to some crops than others. And that's why taking a targeted approach to pest management is something that takes a lot of work. Number one, because you have to sort out who all these individuals are, if they're at levels that are acceptable or damaging. And it's just a big challenge overall. So when you're getting into really wanting to develop these meaningful pest management plans, it is going to take a lot of time, and that's fine. This is a good opportunity for you to get real intimate with the plants that and the insects that affect them. Now, what we're talking about when we're talking about integrated pest management is this is an approach to sustainable pest management that all good farmers should be using. This is a research-driven approach to pest management that basically takes a preventative standpoint all the time. We start with prevention, and then we go to intervention over time if we need to, based on what we're seeing in the pests. Now, when we're talking about this in the sense of approaching this as a strategy for being able to manage pests in a cropping system, when we're talking about the integrated pest management triangle, we're always starting at the bottom and moving our way up. So when we start at the bottom, we talk about cultural controls. And those cultural controls, you can see here on the right-hand margin, the cultural controls are things like site and plant selection. So picking a site where, if you have had soil-borne diseases like Fusarium in the past, picking a site that doesn't have that so that you're not going to be dealing with that to begin with. Plant selection, things like pathogen-resistant plants like powdery mildew resistant cabbage. That's a really great way to put yourself ahead of the game so that you actually have plant material that's going to support you in that. Things like sanitation, keeping your tools clean so you're not passing things back and forth between crops is a great idea. Rotating crops, because if you keep putting the same crop on the same land over and over again, the likelihood is that the pest numbers are going to magnify over time, and that's just going to become a reservoir for pests over time because you're just growing the same thing over and over again in the same spot. So those are just practices that we can incorporate into our normal farming day that actually require no pesticides whatsoever. And this lecture is really geared towards organic farmers or low input farmers, as far as from a chemical standpoint. But what we're talking about are things that really set us up for success without ever having to use a chemical intervention. Now, if we say our cultural controls, we're going to put those all into place because that's prevention, right? The other thing that we might do, if those preventative measures are not working out how we thought they were, and we're still seeing some pests popping up, we're going to lay the second layer of the IPM triangle on top of that to help with all of that. And when we talk about that, we're talking about physical and mechanical controls, things like insect traps, like pheromone traps for things like mating disruption, and we'll talk about that in just a bit. Barriers, so like things like weed cloth. So if you're trying to prevent weeds from encroaching into a crop, one of the easiest ways to prevent weeds without having to spray an herbicide is just to put a weed mat down, so that you're preventing weeds from actually coming up through the soil layer, and you're basically giving a spot for your plants to really flourish without having to compete with weeds. Mulches are another example of that. Mulches are oftentimes not only a good thing for water retention, so things like that might, some pests are related to stress. So like aphids oftentimes can get worse when plants are water stressed because the nitrogen content ends up concentrating in the plant more. So those are types of things that we can often see with pests as well, but they're not something like you would think like, oh, well, water stress is going to cause this problem with a pest. But mulch can help with that by adding to the ability for your plant to retain soil moisture. And then things like tillage and pruning, those oftentimes can be strategies that can be used as a mechanical strategy to disrupt life cycles of lots of different soil dwelling pests as well. When we move up the triangle even further, we're in the biological category. And this is when we start to get into intervention. So when we're talking about like site preparation and plant selection and weed mats and tillage and mulching, a lot of these are preventative measures that we're going to do just because we know they're going to give us a good outcome in some way. But none of these measures at one at a time is going to prevent your pest problem. It's oftentimes the combination of all of these factors that give us good pest management. So we always start with the prevention, but oftentimes we're going to get to a situation where pests might get out of control. And that's where we start with more intervention. That's where the biological category starts to come in, where we could use things like predator insects or parasitoid insects or predatory nematodes to be able to actually combat the crop pests that we have without ever having to introduce a chemical whatsoever. If all of this goes awry and we still are having a pest issue, that's when we get into the chemical interventions. And we always start with the least risky chemicals, meaning the softer chemicals like, soaps or oils or repellents or insect growth regulators or microbials. These are things that are not in the sense of a conventional chemical, in the sense that you think of like your traditional pesticides. These are things that are more that are softer on the environment, and so they're easier to use. And so when you get to that point where you do need to take a chemical intervention, you always go with the softer chemicals first, and then if that doesn't work, your last resort are your most risky chemicals, which are oftentimes your conventional chemicals like pyrethroids and things like that are things that are made to kill on contact. So this is an example of all of these different strategies that we use to get good pest management outcomes by minimizing risk. And you can see also on that sidebar on the left that risk goes up. Each level of the triangle you go up, your risk goes up, not only to you, your crop, but also the environment. So these are all a strategy that we use in a conglomeration, like this multifaceted strategy that we're using to get good pest management outcomes. And so that's what this is all based on. And so when I talk about wanting to create an IPM plan, what I mean is you're trying to create a plan that basically uses all of these different levels to inform how you're going to manage a pest in a crop. And it's a really powerful tool to use. Now, the big thing that you need to also keep in mind is that every decision you make is going to require you to know your farm better than anybody else. You need to know your crop, which you should know what you're planting, but you also need to know the pests that are interacting with those crops and the history of those two interactions between the two. You need to know how the crop is being affected by the pest and what the pest is doing, how bad the damage is. As a farmer, you should be able to say, yes, I understand there is acceptable pest damage. Like if you're a market farmer, you know what a head of cabbage should look like. If it's got a little bit of feeding damage, maybe from a cabbage looper on the outside leaves, you can pull those off and still have a marketable head of cabbage. But if that looper has gone burrowed all the way through that head of cabbage, that is an unmarketable cabbage. And there's a difference between the two. The one that's marketable, that you can just remove a few leaves and still have a marketable product, that is an acceptable pest level. That is a pest that is not causing what we call economic damage, meaning you're not going to lose any money because of that minor damage. The cabbage head that's completely eaten through, that is economic damage. You have lost that crop at that point. So those are two different places within interactions between pest and crop. Some of those interactions are acceptable, and you're never going to have a crop that has no pests. There's always going to be an acceptable level, and then there's going to be a level that's not acceptable, where your marketability of your crop is gone. And that's what we're trying to delineate here by doing what we're going to be talking about in the next slides with scouting, is we're trying to delineate where is that number? Where is the point where I know I need to do something, or I'm going to start losing money because my crop's becoming unmarketable due to pest damage. And that's all driven by your knowledge. A lot of this is not driven by the books, even though we'll talk about a lot of resources that you can use. All of this is driven by your knowledge as a farmer and your ability to say, yeah, that's marketable and that's not marketable. And that's how we're going to set this up as a small farms IPM program through these next two lectures. All right, so let's talk a little bit about pests and cropping systems and why this is all so important for organic farmers. The reason that this is really important for organic farmers is because Organic farmers are we are governed by the National Organic Program for USDA organic certification. If you are a USDA certified organic producer, you have certain inputs that you can use and certain that you cannot. Your chemical controls are very limited when it comes to what you can actually put on your crop compared to somebody that's a conventional farmer that can just use anything that's regulated and approved by the EPA. So the chemicals that you're using as an organic producer are oftentimes low residual toxicity chemicals, so things that don't hang around in the environment very long. They tend to be softer chemicals, so they're kind of easier on everybody when it comes to how they interact with things. Few modes of action, meaning the actual modality by which the chemical takes action on the organism. So whether it's something that's interfering with something within the development of the organism or otherwise, that is something that also is limited when it comes to an organic production. And really, for organic producers, it's those bottom up management options that are really key. So those cultural controls, those mechanical controls are so important to organic producers because you're trying to avoid getting to the point where you're using a conventional chemical. You're not, that's part of the whole goal of all of this, right? You're trying to use things that are softer on the environment, that are easier on the environment from an organic production standpoint. And so your choices are just more limited. And so this type of work becomes much more important for you to be able to maintain successful and marketable crops. And your knowledge of your site is so important here because many sites will be more prone to insects than others. You may be a producer that's next to, say, a conventional cornfield. The pests that you're going to have are going to be very different than someone that's not next to a field like that. Maybe you're next to a real large scale vegetable operation, or maybe you're next to a vineyard or something like that. And Japanese beetles are just insane. Those Japanese beetles that are in those conventional fields are going to drift over into your fields, but your management options are much less than that conventional farmer. So these are all things that you need to understand about your landscape. And that's why scouting is so important, because scouting your crop is the only way that you are going to understand who is in the crop, meaning who are the good guys and who are the bad guys that are in your crop, and at what levels can you manage those and still be able to sell something. That's where scouting comes in. So this is really the cornerstone of integrated pest management. You cannot make a good pest management plan for any organism or any crop without knowing who is in the crop and what levels are acceptable within the crop. So what we do in scouting is we're actually collecting data in order to make management decisions. And that can be something like you see here on the top right, which is a sticky card that we put out and you let it sit out for a week or two. You go out, you collect it, and then you identify and count all the insects on it. Or you can use something like a sweep net that you see in the bottom right, where you go through a crop and you collect sweep samples on a certain on a set standard, and then you count what's in there. And so those are things that you do. The things that you don't want to do from a scouting standpoint is just approach a tomato like you see here in the bottom picture that's covered in stink bugs of all different life stages as far as instar stages. You don't want to just go out to a crop and just see that. You want to be able to say, is that acceptable or is that not? Now, this might not be acceptable, but this also could be maybe just a population center that they're in right now in this juvenile stage that you could remove pretty quickly, and maybe it's not affecting the whole crop. So there are things that really need to be digested as far as like the numbers that you're dealing with and who you're dealing with, and that's where scouting comes in. So we use this data to make decisions about the cropping system and how we're going to manage the pests within it. Because the first thing that you need to know, and what scouting is going to tell you, is who is the pest that's causing the problem in your crop. If you see feeding damage from something that's, chewing down on leaves, it may be something that you see or don't see. But the thing is that most of the time, the insects that you're going to be looking for in a crop are going to be hidden. They're great hiders in these cropping systems. That's what they do. They're a lot of them are camouflaged. See this aphid in the middle here? It's the same color as that stem, and you may not see that just casually walking through a crop. But by using a collection method, you can collect these organisms and identify them in a closed setting without having to just be on the crops and looking for bugs all over the place. So scouting allows us to identify who the pest is that's causing the problem. Is it a Colorado potato beetle? Is it an aphid? Or maybe it's a stink bug? We don't know if we're not seeing the organism do the damage, and that's where scouting comes in with collecting, is being able to tell who it is. The next thing that scouting is going to help you with is what management tactics are going to be effective for the pest. So not only the who, but also the what. Based on who your pest is, there's going to be a range of different management tactics that you can employ to manage that pest, depending on the pest. If it's something that lives on leaves, like Colorado potato beetle that you see on the left here, that's something that you may be able to use an insecticidal soap for if you really got to that point, or maybe some natural enemies. Or I know a lot of organic producers that will hand pick these things off of leaves of potatoes because they're easy to see. I mean, you see how brightly colored these are against a green background. So based on the pest, that is going to influence what management tactics you may use for that pest. Not all management tactics work for all pests. You may have something that weed cloth can help with. You know, you may have a soil-borne pest that you're trying to keep from reproducing in the soil, and maybe creating a barrier is going to help with that. Or you see on the right here, this is an asparagus field. I spent the greater part of 5 years in asparagus in Michigan doing my PhD. And, maybe it's something that you have to use, a sprayer for to apply to be able to have effect on. Depending on what the pest is, the management tactic is going to change. This is also going to inform when you should apply a management tactic, because not all pests are susceptible to management tactics depending on the life cycle that they're in. They could be susceptible to one management tactic more so than another. And I'm going to use the asparagus miner here, Ophiomyosimplex, who was one of the organisms I worked with when I did my PhD. And this is an organism that is a fly in the adult stage, which you could use all sorts of different collection methods to obtain samples of that fly. So that management tactic, you could use, a spray basically to affect a mature fly like that's on a crop. But the larval stage and the pupal stage of that particular organism is in this right picture. You see this tunnel that's on the base of this asparagus stem. That is where the juvenile stages of that fly live. And so if you were to have this fly in the juvenile stage and you're using a spray application to try and control it, that spray application is going to do nothing, because that miner is completely protected in the plant material at that point. So this is also going to inform when you should employ a management tactic, because should I be employing it when I see mostly juveniles, or should I wait until the adult stages emerge so that I can get all of them in one shot? It's going to change depending on your crop. Where is the pest the problem? So it's also going to tell you where the problem is, because going through scouting, you're going to be looking for these things and you're going to be trying to identify them. So on the left side, you see here, a lot of these pests can be hidden. And so maybe it's something that's hidden in a stem, like you see on this left picture, or maybe it's a miner, like you see in the middle picture here. This is another leaf miner here, and that's a larva right there on the inside of the leaf. So where the pest is hiding is also going to kind of be informed by your scouting, because you're going to start to see where these things are residing. Or maybe it's like a looper that's over here, just chewing down on some cabbage that's on the underside of a leaf. All of these places where these pests are going to be different, and that's also going to inform how your management tactic is going to take effect as well, all informed by scouting. So really important. And then comes the why I should manage the pest. Not all pests you're managing because they're causing economic damage, meaning like I shouldn't say economic damage, not because they're causing visual damage to a crop. So like the tomato hornworm you see here on the left, that tomato hornworm, could be affecting your crop, could be affecting your plants. It's visual. You see the damage on them. And so, you want to be, preventing that pest. The why I'm going to manage that pest is because it's affecting my crop, my marketable crop. On the other hand, you may have something like this sharpshooter that you see here on the right, which is a vector for a Zizilla fastidiosa, which is also known as Pierce's disease. That is a disease that is vectored by sharpshooters, and basically you would want to be managing that crop pest not because it's causing visual damage to your crop, it's because it's introducing viruses into your crop, which is going to in turn, affect the growth and the productivity of that crop. So oftentimes the differences there may be differences in why you're actually managing the pest based on visual damage or being a vector for different diseases. Now, when we get into the actual scouting records, so we're going to jump into the tools of scouting here in the next slides. All of what you're observing in your field needs to be recorded. And this is what we're going to really focus on in part 2 of this webinar series, which will be in April, is the actual template that we use for this. And we're going to go through that in detail and show you how to fill this out exactly when you're doing this type of work. But I want to just kind of introduce it here to kind of get you to understand what is the data that's important when we're scouting in a cropping system. Well, the first thing and the most important thing is the date, including the year. These are historical records, and these are records that you're going to use and go back to over time. And so you darn well need to know what day things are happening and when you're making these observations, because they're going to create a trend line for you to be able to kind of see the population dynamics of an organism that you're tracking using this particular system. You're also going to want to note your collection method. And we're going to cover those collection methods here in just a few slides. But we're talking about, did I use a sweep net? Did I use a sticky card like you see pictured here in the right? And that's in a cucumber greenhouse. Am I using a pitfall trap, which is a type of trap that we use for ground-dwelling insects that are seed predators? So you want to understand what is the collection method that I used, and you're going to write that down. And then you're going to write down how you actually did the collection. Did I use a sweep net, and what was the pattern that I used? Did I do a 100-foot row with a sweep net? Did I do 50-foot rows in 2 sections of the crop? If I'm using things like sticky traps, how many traps did I lay out in the greenhouse? What pattern were they in? So just noting how you actually placed these things. Then you're going to note your visual observations, and that is the actual pests and beneficial insects. So you're not just trying to identify pests, you're also trying to identify beneficial insects in this mix as well, because a lot of times people see a lot of insects in a sample and they just assume they're all pests. And in many occasions, you could have a handful of beneficial insects that are controlling your crop pests that you may mistake for pests, and you don't want to incorporate, you don't want to kill, all of your good insects by doing a management tactic that's really focused on eliminating everything. So there's a balance that you can keep here in organic systems with your pests and your beneficial insects, but you need to know who they are. And so that is one of the hardest parts about all of this, is the education part about actually identifying insects. Tons of resources out there. I'll talk about a few here at the end that can help you do that, but that is where your work needs to really come in. If you're not familiar with your crop pests, if you're growing a crop maybe that's new to you, you need to do your work and you need to understand what are the major crop pests that affect this crop. It's usually not a ton. Most crops have a handful of pests in a certain area that really affect a crop. So it's not like you're going to have to learn 100 different insects. You're probably going to have to learn a dozen at the most. So that's a tangible and achievable task right there, but it's something that you really need to take to heart and you need to do as you're kind of developing out these comprehensive management plans. When you're doing your visual observations, you also want to talk about symptoms. What are the damage symptoms that you see? Because a lot of times you're not going to see the insects on the crops themselves. You're going to see the symptoms associated with the damage that they cause. You also want to identify any insects that you recognize. Maybe a ladybug is something that you recognize very readily, or a praying mantis. Those are things that most people know, and so that's something that you're going to put in there is, I see this, or I see this. Life stages as well oftentimes come into play, and that's something that you'll learn as you start to learn the insects you're working with. They oftentimes look very different in different life stages. And if you haven't gone through our biological control lecture, which was earlier this year, one of the webinars, I encourage you to go to the Heroes to Hives YouTube channel and watch that, where we talk about morphology of different types of beneficial insects, what a lot of the common beneficial insects are that you'll see in cropping systems. That was a lecture that we covered, I think, in January. So that's still available to you. But those are things that you want to look for. you're also going to quantify your observations, and that's the most important part about all of this. You're talking about how I collected, what did I see, and then actually quantifying things. And that's not necessarily something you're going to do in the field like right then. That's something usually you're going to collect the insects that you're using the collection method with. You're going to bring them back to the barn and you're going to set them out and you're going to count them, or you're going to freeze the bag that you collect of insects and then you're going to count them. It just makes it easier to count because frozen insects don't move as much as live insects. So when you're quantifying these observations, you're looking for like how many the number of damaged plants that I see, the number of plants that are infested, the number of insects I see on a plant. And some examples would be like 30 plants out of 100 that I looked at had damage on them. Or 14 plants were infested with aphids in a 100-foot row. You don't have to make a judgment on this right now, but you're just collecting the data right here, right? And then like 10 plant hoppers were on a sticky card. So those are numbers that you just collect. They don't mean anything right now, but they're numbers that you're going to collect. The last part about this in this data collection sheet that you're going to use is the damage level. And this is on you. You as a farmer should know what a marketable crop looks like. You know what you can sell. And when it comes down to it, farming is all economics. If you're not making money on a crop, you're not going to be farming for very long. And so you have to make sure that you understand what marketable crops look like. And this is oftentimes dictated by your customer base. Some customer bases, have a very lofty goal of what fruit and vegetables should look like, completely, undamaged and pristine. Other, communities understand that, organic farming, oftentimes you'll have things that, are a little damaged here or a little damaged there. It just depends on what your customer base is willing to accept. But that's part about being a farmer, is figuring out what your market looks like. So what you're going to do in this process is, if you're, going through this day of observation and you get to the end of it and you say, hey, I had 30 plants out of 100 with damage. Was that damage tolerable? Was it impacting my yield? Or was it causing economic loss? Meaning, is it marketable? Meaning it's a tolerable crop, or it's tolerable damage. Is it impacting my yield? Is like a middle ground. It may be impacting my yield, but maybe it's still marketable. So maybe I'm seeing less yield, but the yield I'm still getting is something I can still sell. Or is it total economic loss? Meaning I've lost money on that crop at this point. I'm not going to be able to break even on it. And that's something that's a judgment call on your part. So once you make these determinations, what we do over time is we take all this data together over a season and we plot it out on a graph at some point. And what we'll do is we'll actually be able to see, based on your observations and what decisions you have put into this data sheet, we'll be able to set a target line that says, okay, when I see 30 plants out of 100 in a row that are damaged, I know I am losing money. I have hit my economic loss level. And so what we'll say is that, okay, we're going to step back a few percentage and say, maybe it's when I'm at 20 plants per 100 that have some damage on them, that is now my action threshold. A little less than my economic threshold. And the action threshold is the number that you use to say, okay, at this point, I need to take serious intervention, meaning I either need to incorporate biological controls into my operation, or I need to incorporate a chemical strategy to take care of this, because if I wait any longer, I'm going to start losing money. I'm going to hit that economic threshold. And this is all stuff that we'll talk about in the part 2 of the lecture. But that's the goal that we're shooting for, is an actual number that you can use to inform your pest management decisions, so that when I saw 20 plants that had damage out of 100, I know I need to do something. So it's no longer trying to do this guessing game of like, should I do something or shouldn't I do something? You actually have a number that you can use. Now, for those of you that know me from the Heroes to Hives program and beekeeping, in beekeeping, this is our mite management threshold. This is the 9 mites per 300 bees. This is the same exact thing that we're doing here with this information. It's just all the research has been done for you on the beekeeping end, because bees are one organism and we deal with a few different pests. And so there's been a lot of research to develop that. In a lot of major crops, especially commodity crops like corn and soybeans, there's been research where these levels have been developed for farmers. The challenge for small farmers is that you all, as small farmers, you oftentimes the crops that you're growing, nobody has done the research to actually develop these thresholds for. So it's always just kind of like a roll of the dice of when should I take action, because none of the research has been done to actually create these thresholds for you to make these decisions in a very easy manner. A few years of data collection in a cropping system, you will have that data and be able to make those decisions on your own. It's a very powerful tool to have. All right, so let's talk about the tools that we use in scouting. So your eyes are the best tools that you have. This is the one of the major tools of scouting is these right here, your eyes. And that's important because when we're doing, and when we go back to that data collection, we're doing those visual observations that you see right here. When we're doing those visual observations, that's exactly what you're doing. And what you're looking for are kind of four categories of observations. You're looking for deformities, discoloration, feeding damage, or maybe dead zones in a cropping system. So let's kind of go through these a piece by piece here. So when you look at this particularly, the deformities, let's start with the deformities. So like the top picture right there, those are cupped leaves. And that, you'll see that, you'll notice that. But the organism that's causing that is two-spotted spider mite. So that's a mite that is on the tomato that's causing that damage that you're seeing there. Or like the picture below it, this is a malformed blueberry bud that's been affected by blueberry gallbridge. And so that's another organism that's affecting that particular thing and causing a deformity. You'll see like discoloration as well. The top picture that you see here, I believe this is Swiss chard, and that is a leaf miner damage that you see there. So that bleaching that you see there, that is the miner actually eating the plant material underneath the outer layer of the plant. So it's actually creating mines underneath that epidermis layer. You also have this example down below that. That is black sooty mold. That is mold that's created from aphids, but it's not, the aphids are not on those leaves. The aphids are above this, and what they're doing is that is the honeydew that comes out of the rear end of the aphid, lands on the leaves below it, and then becomes a medium for black sooty mold to take hold. And so when you see this on a plant, these black sooty leaves, oftentimes the aphids are right above them. So, discolorations, you're looking for that. Feeding damage, you see this is a cabbage looper damage on the top picture here, extensive, tunneling and feeding on that. Skeletonizing, like you see on the bottom picture of that same category of feeding, things you would see in like Japanese beetle damage. And then you have dead zones, where things just don't grow in your cropping system. And that could be an indication of things like nematodes, plant parasitic nematodes that are causing things like that. So the first thing you're going to do is, visual assessment of these different types of characteristics, and that's something that you're going to put into your data. Oops. The next tool that we have is a sweep net, and that is one of the tools that you saw pictured in these pictures. That's me in an asparagus field doing sweeping samples. And what you're doing in a sweep net is you're sweeping back and forth in kind of like a figure eight pattern, swiping up the sides of plants or swiping through plants. You can cause a little bit of damage. Typically, plants that are like really heavy or hard to kind of work in general because they're bigger plants, like I'd say like broccolis and things like that. A lot of times you can cause damage to those plants using a sweep net. So this may not be the right tool for all crops, but crops that you can get a sweep net in, like asparagus or a lot of tree crops that are, low growing crops or blueberries, things like that, sweep nets are great for. When you're sweeping, you're going to be basically collecting a whole bunch of insects in that bag, and then you're going to kind of sequester them by basically grabbing at the end there. And then you have a whole bag of material and insects that you can go through and you can identify. The big thing about sweep nets, sweep nets, you can purchase them online. That's totally acceptable. A lot of people, you see the canvas sweep net that I have on the top here. A lot of people like the mesh sweep nets because you can kind of see through them and kind of see what's going on. The big thing with these is when you get a bag full of insects, you can freeze them all. So just throw them in a Ziploc bag and freeze them and then identify them. Or you can sequester them and actually separate them while you're in the field. When you get good at this and you start to understand what are good guys and what are bad guys, you're looking for something specific specific. Like this spider that you see down here, that's a predator, but it's not something that I'm really interested in if I'm looking for my crop pest, right? So I don't have to collect that. But if I am trying to isolate insects, particularly out of a bag sample, the tool that we use for that is called an aspirator. And this is an aspirator. It's this little mechanism here. And basically the way it works is that you got this tube here that is connected to this collection tube below it. And then you've got another tube coming out the other end that's connected to this hose. Now you put the hose in your mouth and you basically go up and you using this front end here, you basically just go and kind of suck up insects with it. It's a very good tool. It's a great way to isolate insects. If you're trying to collect insects to maybe get help on identifying, because you have land grant institutions, all of your extension services in every state in the United States. This is one of the main tasks that they should have as entomologists on staff to help you kind of identify crop pests. This is something that you can use. Now, here's the trick to this. There is a fine mesh that is put onto these to prevent you from sucking up insects. If you do buy an aspirator, you always want to make sure that that mesh is in place. It does move over time. I can't tell you over the 20 some odd years that I've been working in IPM how many insects that I have sucked up. So that is always a risk of using the aspirator, but it is an awesome tool when you're trying to isolate insects in a collection sample. Excuse me. Now, another tool that we can use to collect information for our scouting data is traps. There's lots of different traps out there. So let's start at the top left here. This is a typical sticky trap. Sticky traps are typically something that we use a lot in different systems. They can pretty much be used in any system where you have flying insects that are kind of the thing that you're after. They're used extensively in greenhouse systems. I used to work for the largest plug producer in the United States, ornamental plug producer in the United States in California, and we used these things extensively in all of our greenhouses to monitor greenhouse pests. Things like aphids, whiteflies, those types of insects, thrips are great. You can collect lots of information using sticky cards for those particular insects in greenhouse systems. The one next to that, this is a pheromone trap. This is also known as a delta trap. The delta traps are typically used in orchard systems a lot of times, mainly for things like mating disruption and attract and kill. And basically what you do is, and you can kind of see it back here at the back, there's a pheromone lure that's hanging there for a particular insect. This is common for things like codling moths in apple systems. And so basically you put the trap out and then there's a sticky card inside of the trap, and these hang in a tree, and basically you're attracting all of those insects with a particular lure. So it's actually attracting a specific insect that you're after for monitoring. And for codling moth, this is how you count the number of codling moths that you've got in a system, is by doing this. And so that's another example of a trap. Coming here to the bottom right, so coming reorienting ourselves down to the bottom right, this is what's known as a pitfall trap. Pitfall traps are things that we use for seed predators. So if you're planting a crop and you're noticing that like none of your seeds are coming up, sometimes that can be due to actual predators that feed on the seeds themselves. These are known as carabid beetles, and they're in systems everywhere, but they're ground-dwelling beetles and they crawl around on the ground. You're not going to catch a ground-dwelling beetle with a sticky trap. You have to have something else, and this is what we use, is what we call a pitfall trap. Light traps are something that are also extensively used. You see this light trap that's in a corn system here. Light traps are used for moths particularly. So like European corn borer, diamondback moth, cutworms, those types of things. Those are all moths, and these light traps actually emit light at night and collect moths, and that's how you sample for moth counts. The next trap that you see over here, this is a attract and kill trap for Japanese beetles. It's a trap that has a pheromone on it, and it kills the beetles as they come into the trap. So you basically end up with a whole reservoir of Japanese beetles there. I spent many years collecting Japanese beetles. Let me tell you, these traps get really stinky because usually when you have a Japanese beetle problem, it is intense. And so you collect a lot of these with those particular traps. So those are some examples of different traps that you can use to count the numbers of individuals in a system. The other thing that you have at your disposal to collect data is your cell phone. I encourage all people that I work with that are doing IPM plans or trying to get an idea of what's causing issues in their crop That cell phone is a powerful tool. If you see something, take a picture of it. If it's something that looks weird, take a picture of it, and find an expert to be able to help you with that. Again, all of your extension services at your land grant institutions should have somebody that can help you with not only identifying disease, damage, and insects. Should all be available to you at your land grant institutions. Other tools that are helpful, magnifying glasses. A lot of these insects are very tiny, and that's why scouting is so important, because most of the time you're not going to see these insects that you're going to find when you're doing these collection methods. A loop, something gives you a little magnification, or this is a set of macro lenses that you can use for your cell phone. So if you want to get really good close photos, depending on what kind of cell phone you have, there's a lot of macro lenses available for that as well. The tools, so these are your reference tools. So, you're collecting all this data, you're seeing these weird insects. A lot of you maybe not recognize any of these insects or know, is it a good guy? Is it a bad guy? That's where field guides come in. And that's where these guides come in. University personnel spend a lot of time. I've written contributed to some of these, and especially in asparagus. And they're very powerful tools for people that take advantage of them. You just got to look for them. But say you're an apple producer, there is 100 different field guides and probably for most states that produce apples, there's going to be an individual field guide for your state. Washington has its own field guide for apple pests and pathogens. Those types of things are widely available. You just have to look for them. And what that will do is it will give you the pests that you're going to be dealing with, the pathogens that you're going to be dealing with, and gives you a reference that you can carry around with you in your back pocket. Most of these field guides are made to be carried in the field. That's why they're called a field guide. And so these are great things that you have available to you. You see the second picture here? This is a field guide that's specific to the pests and beneficials in Texas grain sorghum. So very specific that these things get to. And you as a small scale farmer, these are just as valuable to you as a large scale producer, because this is the data that you need to be able, or the information you need to be able to delineate who are these individuals that I'm collecting in these samples. Now, a prime example of why this is so important is the brown marmorated stink beetle and the spined soldier bug. One of my favorite bugs. This is the spined soldier bug. It's a predator that I spent a lot of time working with. I tried to develop a biological pest control program for asparagus beetle using this particular predator. It didn't work out, but that's what research is for, right? To figure out if we can get things to work that we want to work. But basically, the reason I bring this up is because if you look at these two pictures, these two insects look very similar. They're both stink bugs, but they play very different roles in the landscape. So the one on the bottom is the brown marmorated stink bug, which I think pretty much most places in the United States have brown marmorated stink bug at this point. The top one, being the spined soldier bug, does look a little different, and there are morphological characteristics that you can use to determine which one is which, and these are oftentimes talked about in field guides. I have a field guide that's just on stink bugs in my collection. And so one of the things that you can use with these field guides is, like, when you're in the field, you can pick up one of these organisms and look at it and be able to tell, is this a good guy or is this a bad guy? With this particular one, there's 3 characteristics that we use to determine if it's a spined soldier bug or if it's a brown marmorated stink bug. Those 3 characteristics are the shoulders. So you can see the spined soldier bug has this really cool spiky thing at the end of its shoulder. The brown marmorated stink bug has this blunt end to it. The antennae are another thing that we look at. The antennae on the spined soldier bug has no difference in color. It's a one color the entire way, whereas the brown marmorated stink bug has these white bandings that you see on the actual antennae themselves. The other thing that you can see on this is what we call the rostrum, which is the mouth parts here. This is the piercing, sucking mouth parts of this particular organism. And you can see that on the brown marmorated stink bug, you have this very thin mouth part, right? That goes down, that's kind of tucked in right there. And then you have on the the spined soldier bug, you have this really thick mouth part. Now, the reason that those are different is because the thick mouth part on the spined soldier bug, it has to be thick because it's piercing the cuticle of other insects. This insect, when it attacks another insect, it actually sticks that mouth part in it and actually sucks the insides right out of it. So it puts in a digestive fluid into it and then sucks everything right back out of it. Whereas the brown marmorated stink bug, it is piercing plant tissues. So it doesn't need a very hefty mouth part to be able to pierce through those plant tissues. Those are pretty soft. And so that's very easy to do. But those are the diagnostic characteristics that you can use to tell, is this a good bug or is this a bad bug? And these field guides are the way that you're going to do that. The other thing, there's lots of stuff on the internet. One of the best references I like for being able to identify insects that I'm unfamiliar with, even as an entomologist, is bugguide.net. And this is a place where people like myself upload lots of pictures of different things that are observed in different localities. They're all categorized by state. So when you pull up a picture, it's going to say the state, but you can put in a descriptor like I'm looking for a yellow fly in Michigan, and it will help bring that up and help you kind of go through that. It's all picture driven. So it's nice. It's nice for a lot of I'd say like amateur entomologists, let's say that, to be able to utilize. The other thing is that your state extension offices. So I'm here in Michigan. Michigan State is our extension service. They're our land grant institution, and there are a whole cadre of really good folks in cropping systems that work in these systems, that know these systems very well, and that are there to support you when you have a question about things. Ben Phillips is pictured here. He's a former colleague. I used to be an extension agent for Michigan State University Extension. And Ben Phillips was a colleague of mine. He does a lot of work in the Thumb region of Michigan. I believe he's still in that area. He may have moved since I've left the organization. But he deals with a lot of cucumbers and pickles as well in his field. You have bulletins that these... excuse me. You have a lot of bulletins that these individuals put out. So like when spotted winged Drosophila started coming into Michigan, there was all these bulletins that were put out to help you identify what it looks like. What are the characteristics that you're looking like? What does the damage look like? What are the management tactics that you have available for this particular organism? A lot of the hard work has been done for you once you identify what you're dealing with. Or you can see things like the Vegetable Crop Management Guide here. This is one of the guides that is used for the commercial applicator's license here in the state of Michigan. If you want to become a registered commercial pesticide applicator, that is a testing process through the state. But this is one of the study guides, and this guide is an excellent tool to be able to learn all sorts of things about crop pests, because this is what the state is tested on. So if you've got questions about, different types of pests and ways to apply pesticides, that's a great tool to have as well. So all of these tools are available to you. Now, reputable online sources. Okay, so I'm going to jump out of the screen real quick here, and I'm going to bring up this right here. So this is an example of reputable resources for your understanding of crop pests and management tactics after we understand who is dealing with all the issues. So this is the Michigan State University Integrated Pest Management page, and this is where you would go if you're looking for support on integrated pest management in any kind of cropping system. You can see that they have invasives, they have natural enemies, which are biological controls, they have all of your agricultural stuff. If we page down here, you can see there's all sorts of regular bulletins that come out to keep you up to speed on what's going on in systems around your state. Things like, what's coming in, are there pest outbreaks happening somewhere? Last year in Michigan, we had a soybean aphid outbreak that was like off the charts. And this would be somewhere where you would get notified that that's something that's happening. And you're not alone if you see all these aphids just pop up out of nowhere. But this is something that you can subscribe to the newsletter services through these institutions. And they're excellent resources for you. So that's one example of a reputable online source. Another one is things like this. So this is the University of Wisconsin-Madison. They also, have a ton of resources, just like all land grant institutions, and they're typically crop specific because most crops in states are kind of common, right? There's a lot of common crops in certain states. Not all states are like Michigan or California that have a lot of specialty crops. And so if you are in one of those other states, it's going to be even more limited than some of the major producing states of diversity crops. This is an example of potato leafhopper and alfalfa. And in this particular bulletin, if you were interested in potato leafhopper, if you're growing alfalfa and you're interested in how to control potato leafhopper, I want to just draw your attention to here. This tells you how many generations are going to happen per summer. This tells you to take a sweep net, a 15-inch diameter sweep net, and use that to take collection samples. It also tells you how to collect to get a representative estimate of field populations. Take 20 consecutive sweeps in each of 5 areas of a field for 100 total sweeps. they're actually telling you exactly what to do. And then when you get all of that information and you calculate how many insects you have, and you basically distill it down to how many of these potato leaf hoppers did I have per sweep sample, it tells you what your economic threshold is. So like in this situation, if you're dealing with some of these crops that are like major crops like alfalfa, you don't need to go to all the work that we're talking about right here, because a lot of the work has already been done for you. And that just depends on what you're growing. If you're growing a major crop that's commonly grown in your area, the likelihood is a lot of this work has already been done for you. But if you're growing a specialty crop, especially something that's maybe an heirloom varietal or something like that, that's not something that you're going to have access to, because nobody's just done the work. And maybe in some states they've done the work, but for the most part, it's the major commodity crops that a lot of this work has been done on. But this is an example of how you can basically just create you basically have the numbers you need here to make educated decisions for your IPM program on when do I need to actually take action. Another example, and I'm originally from California, and so the the University of California Integrated Pest Management Program, they have an excellent website. And if you live in California, I would highly recommend spending some time here. They basically have your agricultural pest labeled by crop, and you can go into these crops. Let's take peppermint, for example. It'll tell you what are the major things that you're going to be dealing with as far as insects. It'll tell you what are the major things you're going to be dealing with disease, common weeds that you're going to be dealing with, and then it's going to give you all sorts of information on chemical resistance and things like that. These are excellent resources for any crop that you're dealing with. And even if you're not in California, a lot of the information here is applicable to other states as well. Like two-spotted spider mite is everywhere. So that's not going to be something that's unique just to California. But that's a great example of some other resources that are available to you that are very reputable. You want to make sure, the big thing with like online stuff is anybody with a cell phone can call themselves an expert nowadays, right? I mean, you literally video something and then post it on YouTube, and all of a sudden you're an expert in the field. When in actuality, you may know nothing about the topic. And so make sure that you're going for reputable resources when it comes to these, to managing pests. Also keep in mind that if you are going to have to use a chemical intervention, whether it's organic or not, the label on that product is a legally binding document. You are legally bound to follow the directions on that label by the Environmental Protection Agency. And so that's something that you really need to take consideration of, is that you want to be getting your information from reputable online sources, because if somebody's telling you to do something that's illegal and their credentials are questionable when it comes to who they are and what they actually know about a crop, that can put you in trouble, especially if you're marketing these things to the public, right? If you're selling your crop to the public, you want to make sure that you're doing things right, and making sure that you have reputable sources is really important. All right, so we're going to wrap it up for tonight. What is the next step? And this is the next lecture next month, is we are actually going to be able to create a basically threshold for our integrated pest management program. And this is what we'll end up with at the end of the next lecture. We'll go through some examples, and we'll talk about how we collect data. We'll talk about how we use that data, how we plot that data, and then we will end up with this product right here. And I will give you templates for all of this for those of you that are attending the next one. And basically we take it, you see the x-axis here. This is the dates that we collected our samples. So this was a weekly sampling that we were doing for our scouting over the course of an entire season. And then we have our average number of insects counted per unit. And then we have all of this information on the top. What we're collecting here is we're collecting flea beetles, is what we're after, in collards. And the particular variety is tiger. And so this is a specific threshold graph for that specific crop. And what we found out when we collected this data based on our observations, is my economic loss, the point at which my crop was unmarketable, was right around 50 flea beetles per unit. And then the action threshold we set just below that. So we don't want to get to that economic loss threshold. We're trying to just stay below the action threshold. So once you hit that action threshold, you got to do something. All right, that's all I have for tonight. I see Jessica has a question. She's our only question for the year, for the lecture. Does climate matter for your records, such as a dry year, wet year, cool year, hot year? Yes, and that is something that we will talk about in the next lecture. It is something that you're going to observe. It can have very big effects on certain pest populations. Like last year, we had an intense drought here in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, and it was one of the things that we think was responsible for the outbreak of the soybean aphid that we saw last year. year. And why I mean an outbreak, I mean every corn plant that I had was covered from tip to bottom in aphids. I mean, covered in them over the course of a night. And so that's something that you definitely want to take into consideration, and we'll talk about. And I see Eric's next question. And Eric, I got a slide just for you. Next lecture is on April 15th, same time. Those of you that registered for this webinar, you've registered for the whole series, so you're going to get the reminder email from me every single one of these until you say you don't want it anymore. So if you've already been registered, you're already good for that. For those of you that are watching the recording, you'll register at that link below there to register for the Heroes to Hives webinar, and that's an Ag and Heroes to Hives webinar series for this year. So I thank you all for joining us. Oh, we're wrapping up right on time, too. And thank you all for joining me tonight. Hope you enjoyed it. And we will see you at the next lecture. Thanks again, everybody.